Thanks for joining me again today as we continue our study through the Psalms. Today we're going to be beginning a look at the Psalms of disorientation. Last week we talked just briefly about the Psalms of orientation. I didn't want to spend too much time on those for a couple of reasons. One, because the Psalms of disorientation actually make up the largest category of Psalms that we have. The lament Psalms, as you may have heard them called, are by far the most written type of psalm that we have. But also because I think that Psalms of orientation are something that we are maybe a little more familiar with, a little bit more comfortable with already. But Psalms of disorientation take us to a new world, a place that maybe we as Christians are sometimes afraid to go to, or maybe sometimes we're uncomfortable going to, or maybe sometimes we just don't go there because we're unsure about where it may lead us to. Walter Brueggemann, which we've been using his book quite a bit, begins his chapter on Psalms of disorientation this way, and I think he does a fantastic job of stating this. He said, "The problem with a hymnody that focuses on equilibrium, coherence, and symmetry, Psalms of orientation, is that it may deceive and cover over. Life is not like that. Life is also savagely marked by disequilibrium, incoherence, and unrelieved asymmetry. In our time, perhaps in any time, that needs no argument or documentation." What he's saying here is that the reason the Psalms are much more heavily focused on disorientation is because that's life. Life is oftentimes much more, we feel like we are much more in a state of disorientation than we are orientation. If we remember, orientation is a state of things are good. Everything in my life is working together. Plans are coming together. I see the good things that are happening. I see the ways that God is blessing me. I feel blessed. I feel that life is just going my way. Everything is happening the way that I want it to. And because of that, I am in a state of orientation. But much more frequently, we live our lives in a state of disorientation, of disarray. Things are not going exactly how I had hoped that they would. My heart is troubled. There are difficult things, the relationships that are strained. I'm worried about financial issues. I'm worried about the stresses of work and of everyday life and of raising kids, of having a family, of being friendly towards my family. And there are just so many things. I am overwhelmed. I am stressed. And God, I just need help. That is where I think more often than not, most of us spend our lives. I think most of our lives is categorized by that idea of disorientation. We still have moments of orientation. We have moments of new orientation, which we'll get to in a few weeks. But most of our lives, we are in that state of disorientation, of struggling to know what went wrong and how we can reorient ourselves back to where we want to go. Brueggemann also states a little bit later in that chapter, "It is no wonder that the church has intuitively avoided these psalms. They lead us into dangerous acknowledgement of how life really is. They lead us into the presence of God where everything is not polite and civil. They cause us to think unthinkable thoughts and utter unutterable words." Later in that paragraph, he says, "It embraces the darkness as the very stuff of new life. Indeed, Israel seems to know that new life comes nowhere else." Psalms of disorientation, at least for me growing up, were something that were very rarely talked about. I would say the Psalms as a whole weren't frequently talked about, but especially the Psalms of disorientation were very much avoided. And that's not been all that long ago since I remember that, because they are uncomfortable. They are a little bit odd. We see language used here that sounds very, very wrong to us. The psalmists oftentimes accuse God of abandoning them, of leaving them. The psalm we're going to look at today does that very thing, and that can be uncomfortable for us. We say, how is this in Scripture? Why is it in Scripture that people are blaming God? Sometimes I hear people saying that if you question God, if you ever have doubts or questions, then maybe your faith isn't as strong as you think that it is. And I don't think that's the case, because in the Psalms we see these people are trusting or questioning God time after time after time. They are always, in these Psalms of disorientation, questioning him and struggling with why, in their eyes, he's not giving an adequate answer. And while, yes, I think that maybe to an extent, when we look at these Psalms and we see the questioning, that there is, I won't necessarily say that. I think that it's easy for us to look at it, to look at those questions, to look at the people who are questioning God. I think it's easy in our lives today to see people who are questioning God and say, well, they're just not faithful enough. They just need to have more faith. They need to trust God more. But when we look at the Psalms, when we look at those who are questioning God in the Psalms, very rarely is my concern, oh, well, they must not be trusting God enough. In fact, when I look at people questioning God, when I look at David and the ways he questions God, my initial thought is, wow, he has so much trust to feel like God has turned his back on him, and yet he still cries out to him. I think oftentimes we assume that's an act of distrust, when in reality, if we feel like someone has turned our back on us, very often our response is to turn our backs on them. And to see people instead crying out and questioning God, that is an act of great faith, saying, God, I know you're there. Please show me your presence. I need to know you're there. There are several different types of Psalms of disorientation, though. Most of them are lament Psalms. But there are a couple different types of lament Psalms. There are both personal laments, and then there are also communal laments, or laments of community. I want to look this morning at a psalm of personal lament, and that is Psalm 13, one that you very well may be familiar with. It's probably my favorite psalm. It's one that I hear the words and they speak very clearly to me. But as I read this, I want to make the suggestion that you, it's on YouTube, it's on Spotify, I'm sure it's elsewhere, but that you go find the song Psalm 13 by Nate Hale. Nate Hale was a student at Lipscomb University while I was at the high school, and he wrote a song simply called Psalm 13. If you type in Psalm 13 Nate Hale on YouTube, it's the very first thing that comes up. And he takes this psalm and he puts it into song form. And the way that he does that, the reason I love that is because he expresses the emotion of the psalm so purely and so beautifully. These psalms are not meant to be read as psalms of orientation. They're not meant to be read as in moments of peace and quiet and tranquility, but these are cries to God. And I think they should be read as such, where we are crying out to him, where we are not sitting here and calmly reading, but we are crying out to God with great emotion, with great passion, because we deeply, deeply care for him and we want answers. And so I'd recommend that you listen to that song, that you would pause now and listen to the song as we read through the psalm. How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts and day after day have sorrow in my heart? How long will my enemy triumph over me? Look on me and answer, Lord my God. Give light to my eyes, or I will sleep in death. And my enemy will say, I have overcome him, and my foes will rejoice when I fall. But I trust in your unfailing love. My heart rejoices in your salvation. I will sing the Lord's praises, for he has been good to me. David here is crying out with all his might to God, God, you have forgotten me. You are hiding from me. I do not know where you are. I am wrestling. I am struggling. My enemy is triumphing over me, and I need your help, O God. You have abandoned me. Answer me, God. Give me what I need. Give me an answer. Allow me to know why this is happening, why you have abandoned me. But we see that switch towards new orientation at the very end of the psalm. That even in the midst of some of his darkest days, even when it feels like life is crashing down all around him, David looks to God and says, but I trust in your unfailing love. Because even when he feels as though God has abandoned him, even when he feels as though life cannot get any worse, when he feels that this is the absolute worst that life will ever get for him and he will never be able to recover from this, he still trusts in God. He doesn't turn his back on God the way that he feels that God has to him, but instead he says, I will trust in you and I will continue to sing God's praises. Most of our life is categorized by disorientation. That's just something that we're going to have to live with. But I hope that these psalms of disorientation, can help us to remember that it's okay to be disoriented. And it's okay to cry out to God with questions. But we must continue to sing our praises, to continue to tell God that I will trust in your unfailing love. Because even in our worst and darkest days, he has been good to us.